how was India embarrassed in this war?
One thing was that the embarrassment actually happened on 20th of November because the Chinese repeatedly kept it. One was the Tibetan aspect, right, that I spoke about, that there was this perception within Beijing that India was supporting the Tibetan rebellion. But beyond that, there was also a perception in which was aligned to the previous perception. There's a perception within Beijing that India was becoming an ally of the United States, right? And whereas India was outwardly non-aligned, it was clear. Nehru was very clear that India is a non-aligned nation, and we are not going to join either of these blocks. Be the US-led capitalist bloc or the Soviet-led communist bloc. But because of the IB's arrangement that I just told you previously, right, about launching these Tibetan guerrillas and so on, there was a tacit understanding between India and the United States that if at all it came to an all-out war with India, then the United States would somehow step in, right? So if at all the Chinese it came to a position where it reached if India's survival was at stake, then the United States would interfere on behalf of India. Now on 20th of November, because of India's own misreading of the situation, because we did not know what kind of there was a complete misreading of China's intentions in this war. The prime minister wrote a letter to the American president John F. Kennedy at that point in time, seeking air assistance. That now is the time we want you to help us because we are facing decimation here, right? The moment those letters were sent, within 2 hours, the Chinese called a unilateral ceasefire and they went away. Right now, that became a huge humiliation because people now started to question India's credentials as a non-aligned nation because you went running to the United States for help. And the Chinese said that, look, we had nothing to do. I mean, we didn't want to decimate you in the sense that you thought of. We just wanted to show that, we're capable of hurting you. And we just demonstrated that. Now, the third humiliation comes because, in fact, if India had used its air force, or if the Indian military had needlessly not ordered a withdrawal from certain areas, India could have put up a fight and, in fact, turned the tide against the Chinese. Now, because of such faulty defense policies, the Chinese secured a victory that was absolutely unimaginable even to them. It is because of this reason that it is considered this particular war is considered an absolute humiliation to India, because we expected something like a World War II kind of an incident, especially when you look at what happened in France and places. We expected something like that, but that did not happen. Right. So towards the end of and remember what I was telling you at the start of this conversation itself, that Nehru saw India as the leader of the third world. Right. So it was a reputation. It was that reputation that was also at stake here. So in one day, almost every credentials that India stood for. One was as the leader of the third world, then as a strict adherent of the non-aligned movement, and a probable bulwark against China and so on. All of it was shattered in one go. So that is why it's considered as a humiliation.
So how did India's China policy change after that? I imagine there weren't people still arguing that China and India could peacefully coexist as leaders of Asia.
Yeah, that's true. In the immediate aftermath, all those of all ideas of friendship with China were virtually shut, and so immediately what happened was an era of unprecedented friendship between India and the United States opened up, which would last only for about 2.5 years, not more than that, because of United States' own policy changes, and they felt that now is the time for them to reach out to the Chinese. So in that interim, in those 2.5 years, especially in the field of intelligence and security, there was a lot of cooperation that commenced between India and the US, especially three covert action agencies that were established in India around that time were established thanks to the support of the United States and Britain. So two agencies were one was called the Aviation Research Center, and the other one was called the Special Frontier Force. The Aviation Research Center was an organization meant to conduct secret reconnaissance and get imagery intelligence and so on. That was established thanks to the support from the United States. And you had another organization called the Special Frontier Force, which was manned by Tibetans. So that was again supported by the United States, and there is another organization which was created with the support of the British. So we leave that for the time being. So this is one thing that happened. So there were air defense agreements signed between India and the United States. So there was it was a it was a complete turnover in India's attitude towards China. But whatever, in fact, again, this is where the power of the narrative actually comes into play. Whereas the Chinese have been able to capitalize on what really happened in 1962, and even make it even more, embellish it with their own myths, and make it seem like it is a massive humiliation to India that needs to be repeatedly thrown at their faces. I think India somewhere failed to shed enough light on what happened in the subsequent years. In 1967, in a place called Sundarangju, in India actually got an upper hand over the Chinese. But again, for reasons best known to India, we did not really make a big news out of it. And again, in 1971, another tiny little part. In 1971, India and Pakistan went to a war, and the result was the creation of Bangladesh. It was one of the outright victories that India had secured since independence. But there was an interesting event in that war as well. So when the war actually commenced between India and Pakistan, this time China and United States were together on the side of Pakistan. Whereas India had, because they knew that the United States and China were together with Pakistan on this, India had signed a treaty of friendship with the Soviet Union, right? So when the war commenced and the Pakistanis were not really, when the script was not going as per their wishes, the Pakistanis immediately sent an SOS to China, telling that, look, now is the time we want you to bring up your forces and attack India on your borders. But the moment the Chinese started to make the preparations, India contacted Soviet Union and said that, look, now is the time we want you to act on the basis of this treaty of friendship that we signed with each other. And the Soviets mobilized about 47 divisions to the Sino-Soviet borders, and the Chinese then did not, dare do anything at all, right? Yeah, but this event is very. I mean, most scholars who even record the 1971 war don't talk about this, right? They just give credit to other diplomats and the Indian military planners themselves to say that the Chinese somehow did not, they chose not to attack us and all that. But the point is that the Indian RNDW, that is the new foreign intelligence agency that was created in 1968, they had a very vital role to play at that point in time. So, but even after, but from then on, from 1979, we're jumping a few years now. From 1979, once you had Deng Xiaoping come to power in China, he was more focused on economic growth and so on. So he did not really want conflict with India at that point in time. And India also felt that it's time for us to reach out to China and see if we can make friendship with them. So efforts began in the 1980s, and by mid 1980s we were again, we were not some bit of opening happened, but we were not best friends because some of the military exercises that were conducted in the late 1980s, one of them known as Operation Checkerboard, that actually there was a mobilization scene to estimate if there is something we could to see how well prepared the Indian military was in terms of taking on a hostile China, if at all it was. So yes, the relationships began to see ups and downs, but in the immediate aftermath of the 1962 war, things were really bad. There was complete hostility between the two countries. It is only in the year 1993 when an agreement was signed between India and China that the relationship was back on track. But whatever has happened now, I think it's all gone out of the window.
I mean, this is it just shows how global politics can really make for strange bedfellows. I mean, the idea that India and the Soviet Union on one side and China and the U.S. on the other side, and so I imagine in today's climate, this creates challenges for India and the U.S. working together against China, while India also has its relationship with Russia today. So how do things move forward, considering all the challenges that history has thrown in our wake?
Just to add fuel to a little bit to your fascination with the kind of strange bedfellows you're talking about. When after the 1971 war had happened, so once the Chinese withdrew because of the Soviet mobilization, it was now the United States' turn to show its might against India. So it sent in a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier to the Bay of Bengal region. It is called the USS Enterprise. Once again, it required the Soviet intervention for the Americans to then, get back, and things were then resolved. But it came very close to a nuclear war, but things were resolved. But what happened, interestingly, after the war was India realized that until that point, the United States was not a target of Indian intelligence. But the moment the USS Enterprise entered the Bay of Bengal, a decision was taken in New Delhi to make US also a target of India's foreign intelligence. And when that was made, especially to monitor their activities in the Indian Ocean region, when that was made, India had to cooperate with two other countries to develop that kind of intelligence capability. And to speak of strange bedfellows, the two countries that cooperated with India were the French and the Iranians. The Iran,
Wow. Okay.
yeah. So the Iranians under Shah at that point in time, they were an ally of the United States, and the French were also an ally of the United States. But they felt that there was a need to monitor American movements in this region. But yeah, that's one thing. Uh, but coming to your question about today's scenario, look, the thing is that it's very hard for the United States to get Indians to trust them, right? There is enough and more evidence to show that yes, you could make an argument and talk to a pragmatic Indian and say that look, they were just the dictates of the Cold War that we happen to find you on the opposite side, but things have changed now, right? But even now, there's enough and more evidence to show that the United States hasn't completely changed. So, for instance, we most people like to talk about CIA's interference in democratic processes in other countries and so on. But I think just in the last couple of days, there's been a lot of talk about the State Department's interference as well in India's democracy in terms of shaping narratives by clubbing with some fact checkers and so on and so forth. Now, these are things that actually, especially in a democracy like India, where you have political leaders who do not want to do anything that will not win them the elections, or which will drastically impact their electoral prospects. These are some things that are very tricky to handle. But that said, there is also an understanding in India that the Chinese are far ahead of us in any terms of capabilities, and probably the only country we can rely on to a certain extent is the United States. So you will see cooperation between India and the United States, but it will not take the kind of shape that you see between, say, the UK and the US, or Australia, the AUKUS kinds and all that. So that kind of cooperation is virtually impossible. That's not going to happen because India strongly and rightfully believes that India does not have natural friends in this world. I mean, that's something that India has rightly understood now. So yes, so for example, we had a Chinese incursion in that region called Arunachal Pradesh that I was talking about, Yangtze region, and some of the newspapers reported that the Americans had given us prior warning, because of the satellite imagery and so on, which makes but once the news was out, the White House did not really comment on it. They said that we have nothing to comment on this, right? Now it makes for a great reading, great PR. A lot of people would then say that look here, the Americans are actually supporting us. But if you talk to Indian military personnel who actually served in that terrain, right, they know clearly well that Indians are at a certain height where visually they can see what's happening. So you don't need the American satellites to tell us what is happening there, right? So there are certain other areas where we would need support. For instance, with regard to Pakistan, right? That's an important question that most people don't talk of, because they look at China and Pakistan as two different entities, but they're not, right? It is because India settled the Pakistan problem to a greater extent by 2019. That's when you see China getting too assertive and aggressive with India. Because until then, what had happened was the Chinese trusted the Pakistanis to keep India, caught down in the South Asian region. But the moment, in 2019, we made certain constitutional changes in the state of Jammu and Kashmir, and state-sponsored terrorism from Pakistan was coming low. We almost had zero casualties in territories outside the Kashmir Valley. So when all this was happening, it was a message to China that look, now India is getting increasingly assertive, and they had to do something. So it was that frustration that actually led them to act, and the whole Galwan clashes happened. But then the question that many Indians would then ask is, why didn't the US step into support at that point? Right? Before you knew it, the Ukraine war started, and the entire Western media focus, Western policy focus was on Russia and not on China. right? And now what is to say? Now, if since you're talking about the 1962 war, after 62, both India and the United States were on the same page. They knew that China is a threat, but within 9 years, the US and China were together attacking India, right? Now, what is to say that for some reason things won't turn around, and and the United States and China won't be friends again? Because even today, there's a great reliance on each other for economic purposes, for trade purposes, and so on. So in that worst case scenario, where can India go? Because we don't see a bipolar world today, right? If we could make friendship with the USSR to offset this imbalance that is coming as by virtue of China, Pakistan, and United States alliance. But today, who does India have to look? And that is where India says that yes, US is a viable partner. It is a very good partner to have, but we have to strengthen our own capabilities, and that's why the prime minister repeatedly uses the word called atmanirbharta, that is to be self-sufficient, right? So but one thing is clear, that India and China are not going to be friends. There is going to be this conflict, but India is very clear that this conflict will not be allowed. Will not. I mean, there is no way that other powers can come and encash on this conflict for their own benefits. So if we can avoid this kind of a problem, then there is enough and over room for India and the United States to cooperate with each other.